Empaths. They called it a gift. But no one told you the gift could consume you. Carl Jung warned, the deeper your sensitivity, the more vulnerable you are to psychic possession, not by demons, but by the unlived lives of everyone around you. You did not come here by accident. Something in you, quiet, subtle, but undeniable, has always known that your pain is not entirely your own, that the heaviness you carry in your chest, the sorrow that wakes you in the night, the rage that flares without warning, may not begin inside you at all. Perhaps you've been called too sensitive, told you feel too much, care too deeply, see too far into what others try to hide. You thought it was empathy, and it is. But not the kind you read about in pop psychology books or spiritual memes embroidered with pastel butterflies. This is the kind Jung spoke of in hushed tones, the kind he saw in dreams and in patients teetering on the edge of madness and mysticism. This is the kind that opens you not only to love, but to the darkness in others they themselves cannot bear to face. Because to be a true empath in the Jungian sense is not to walk the world absorbing every feeling like some gentle healer with outstretched hands. No. It is to become a psychic lightning rod through which the unconscious of the collective world attempts to discharge itself. It is to be a carrier of shadows, a vessel for pain that was never yours to begin with, a spiritual battlefield on which ancestral wounds, unlived griefs, and archetypal chaos all converge without your consent. And most terrifying of all, you don't even know it's happening, because no one taught you to protect yourself. Jung wrote, "The unconscious has no moral compass. It is not interested in fairness or clarity. It will jump bodies like fire jumps branches, and it seeks out the open, the porous, the unguarded. And if your empathy is unconscious, if you do not know where you end and another begins, you will become a haunted house, not by spirits, but by the emotional residue of 1,000 unfinished stories. You feel tired all the time. You cry for no reason. You're drawn to broken people like a moth to flame. Not because you're weak, but because something in you unconsciously agreed to carry what they couldn't hold. This is not kindness. This is possession. And Jung saw it again and again, in the woman who could feel her mother's sorrow across continents, in the boy who learned to read his father's rage before it even reached the surface, in the therapist who lost herself in every client's wound until she no longer knew who she was when she closed the door. He saw it in dreams. Eyes blindfolded, hands trembling, voices crying out from below a chasm. He called it a fusion with the shadow of the other, an archetypal seduction so subtle it masquerades as compassion, but is in fact a disguised form of self-erasure. If this is the cost of your empathy, then maybe it's time to ask, whose pain are you really carrying? And what will happen to you if you keep carrying it? Let's go deeper. You were told that empathy meant understanding others, feeling their joy, their sorrow, their longing. But Carl Jung would have laughed at such simplicity, because what you call empathy he saw as something much more ancient, more powerful, and more dangerous. You don't just feel others, you receive them. You don't just understand their pain, you carry it. And here is the truth no one ever told you. The deeper your gift, the more open your soul becomes as a conduit, a psychic instrument through which not only emotions, but entire unconscious patterns, archetypes, traumas, and ancestral wounds begin to move. You think that grief is yours. That sudden shame, that nameless dread, that overwhelming sadness in the presence of someone else. No, my friend, You are not just sensitive. You are being possessed. Not in the Hollywood sense, not by demons in the shadows, but by what Jung called the autonomous complexes of the unconscious. Forces that are not bound by time or logic or moral reasoning. They do not knock before entering. They seep through the walls of your boundaries when you don't know you need any. And because no one ever taught you this, because all you ever heard was, "You're such a good listener. You're so caring. You have a big heart." You began to believe that this was love, that your role in life was to feel for everyone, to help everyone, to absorb whatever pain they brought with them. You confused open-heartedness with psychic permeability. But Jung's work warned of this exact confusion. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between what belongs to you and what does not. It only moves toward what is unguarded. And if your boundaries are weak, if you have not done the work of building an inner container, a psychological structure, then the unconscious of others enters you like water through a cracked cup. You become a host to feelings that were never yours. You become a battleground for sorrows you cannot name. You become, as Jung once described in a dream, a blind woman on a bridge, reaching outward and inward at once, trembling with the voices of the void below. And still, you call it kindness. You tell yourself this is what it means to be spiritual, but the truth is, you are haunted. Not by ghosts in white, but by the unintegrated shadows of every person who has leaned on you without knowing how to carry themselves. The man whose rage you tried to soothe, the friend whose sadness filled your lungs like smoke, the lover whose brokenness you tried to mend with your own skin. None of it belonged to you, but you took it in. Because that's what the unconscious empath does, until they learn another way. And here is where the descent begins, where the real journey takes shape. Because now, perhaps for the first time, you must ask, where do I end and where does the other begin? Not as a spiritual idea, but as a matter of survival. Because if you do not learn this, if you do not name what is yours and what is not, you will drown in a sea of shadows that were never meant to be carried. This is not the path of empathy. This is the path of energetic possession, and it's time to wake up. But to do so, you must go even deeper. The empath who has not built a boundary is not just kind. They are a vessel left open in a storm, collecting everything, mud, blood, memory, sorrow, until they are overflowing with ghosts they cannot name. Jung once wrote, "The unconscious of one person can act upon another unconsciously." And this is exactly what happens when you walk into a room and immediately feel heavier. You think it's sensitivity. But what if I told you it's absorption? You didn't just notice their sadness. You inhaled it. You didn't just understand their anger. You carried it into your nervous system like a parasite hiding inside your breath. And the more you do this without awareness, the more your psyche, once whole and vibrant, begins to fray at the edges, like a cloth soaked too long in another person's grief. At first, it feels like compassion. Then one day, you can't get out of bed. You can't explain why you're crying. You can't find your own voice inside your body, because you are no longer alone in your psyche. You've become a mirror full of strangers, and each one is speaking louder than your soul. And here is the most terrifying part. It doesn't feel wrong. It feels familiar. Because so many empaths were trained in childhood to be hyper-attuned to the emotions of others, just to feel safe. The daughter who felt her father's mood change before he ever raised his voice. The boy who learned to cheer up his mother so she wouldn't vanish into silence. That is how the pattern was born. Not in adulthood, but in survival. And so now, in every adult relationship, your body continues the ritual. Feeling for everyone, fixing everyone, fusing with everyone. But this is not healing. This is energetic codependency. It is the unconscious bargain of the wounded empath. If I carry your pain, will you love me? If I absorb your anger, will you stay calm? If I disappear, will you finally see me? Jung warned of this fusion. He called it participation mystique, a kind of psychic entanglement where the boundary between self and other dissolves entirely. And while it may sound romantic to feel so deeply, this is not depth. This is drowning. When you do not discern between what is yours and what is theirs, your psyche begins to fragment. Depression sets in. Your nervous system collapses under weight that was never yours to bear. You become a walking contradiction, deeply attuned to the world, yet utterly lost inside yourself. This is how the empath becomes emotionally disoriented, haunted by moods that have no origin, weighed down by a fatigue that sleep cannot touch, and constantly questioning, why do I feel so much, and yet feel nothing of myself? And here lies the danger that few dare speak. The more unconscious you remain about this gift, the more likely it is that your gift will become your curse. You'll begin to define yourself by what you absorb. You'll feel important for being needed. You'll mistake merging for love and carrying pain for purpose. But Jung reminds us, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And if you want to climb toward clarity, you must go down into the hell of your own confusion and ask, where do I end? And where do they begin? Because without that knowing, your empathy is not love. It is self-erasure. And this is where the spiral turns. You've seen the cost of carrying the shadow. Now let's talk about what happens when the shadow begins to carry you. There is a dream I once heard. A woman stands on a narrow bridge above a chasm. She is blind. Her arms stretch out, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she cannot see. Below her, in the depths, rise voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, whispers and screams, longing and rage, all surging upward into her skin. She does not know their names. She does not know their origins. She only knows the ache. She feels them as if they were her own, but they are not. This woman is the empath, and her blindness is not of the eyes. It is a blindness of boundaries. She cannot distinguish between her soul and the shadows clinging to it. This is what happens when empathy becomes possession. The empath absorbs what was never theirs, and the soul becomes a vessel overrun by ghosts. Jung understood this deeply. To him, the dream world was not symbolic fluff. It was the theater of the unconscious. And in the theater, archetypes speak in images. He wrote of the collective unconscious, a realm that connects every human psyche through shared patterns, instincts, and ancient fears. And in this realm, the empath is not merely a feeling person. They are a psychic instrument, a tuning fork that vibrates with what the tribe has left unhealed. So when the empath suffers, they do not suffer only their own story. They carry the shame their mother never voiced, the rage their father never unleashed, the sorrow of a grandmother who lost everything but never cried. I once treated a woman who wept every time she spoke. At first, we thought it was grief from a recent breakup, but months in, something deeper emerged. She had become the emotional surrogate for 3 generations of silenced women. She wept because no one else had permission to. Her tears were not hers. They were inherited. A psychic heirloom passed down like an antique spoon. Except this one was filled with ancestral sorrow. This, Jung would say, is the work of the archetype. It is not just history repeating. It is the unconscious choosing a vessel. And the empath, if unconscious, is the perfect host. Another dream. A man walks through a museum. Inside are statues of everyone he's ever loved. But on each one reads the same sign. Do not touch. Property of the dead. And yet, he touches them. And every time, they bleed. This is what happens when you try to heal pain that isn't yours to hold. You reanimate it. You give life to something meant to be buried. You become a keeper of ghosts. And soon, your soul becomes the museum. This is not empathy. This is necromancy. And here we arrive at the central paradox. Your gift to feel others so deeply can become the very reason you lose yourself. Because if you don't know where your pain ends and theirs begins, you will spend your life walking across bridges like that blind woman, listening to the cries of the chasm, thinking they belong to you. But what if they don't? What if you've spent years carrying spirits who never asked to be saved, and wouldn't know what to do with your light even if you gave it freely? And what if you stopped? What if you stepped back from the edge of the bridge, turned inward, and finally asked, "Who is weeping inside me that I have never met?" Because until you name the ghosts, they will live through you, and their hunger is endless. But once you name them, once you confront them not as victims but as visitors, something sacred happens. You stop being a sponge, you become a vessel, and from here, we enter the crucible of choice. The question is no longer, what do I feel? It becomes, what do I choose to carry? There is a lie that many empaths live inside. It doesn't speak in deceitful words or malicious intent. It whispers like virtue. It smiles like compassion. It disguises itself as love. It is the illusion that to help is always holy. But Jung knew better. He warned us, not with sermons, but with dreams, that unconscious helping is a mask. And behind that mask, something ancient stirs. At first glance, the empath looks noble, carrying the pain of others, rushing in with soothing words, absorbing conflict like a sponge, hoping to clean the room. But look closer. Beneath the noble intention is often a hidden contract, signed in the unconscious, sealed with silence. If I save you, maybe I won't have to save myself. There is a danger in this. A danger that Jung saw play out not just in patience, but in myth, in archetype, in the collective. It is the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who devotes their life to easing the suffering of others. Not because they are whole, but because healing others distracts them from their own wounds. This healer doesn't bleed openly. They bleed in service. And in that sacrifice, they feel significant. Because the pain makes them feel needed. That is possession. Not by demons in the old sense, but by psychological patterns so old, so unconscious, that we forget they are not us. We confuse our need to help with the soul's actual purpose. Jung once wrote that the unconscious always compensates. And when a person becomes too identified with their light, the shadow grows behind them like a storm waiting to break. For the empath, this storm often arrives in the form of emotional burnout, resentment masked as kindness, exhaustion mistaken for just being too caring. But it's not just exhaustion, it's over-identification with the savior, with the martyr, with the irreplaceable one. And what does this archetypal possession sound like? I'm the only one who understands them. They'd fall apart without me. I can't rest until I fix this. And so the empath doesn't rest. They fuse, they lose their center, and slowly, without even realizing it, they become the rescuer who controls with comfort, who manipulates with mercy, It is not out of malice. It is out of an ancient wound. If I am not needed, will I still be loved? But help without boundaries is not healing. It is fusion. And fusion, for the soul, is imprisonment. There is no transformation in being absorbed, only dissolution. I once worked with a woman who described her relationships as always giving, always helping, always carrying. But underneath her bright smile and gentle demeanor lay a terror of being alone. Helping was not just kindness, it was currency. Her value had become synonymous with sacrifice. She wore her exhaustion like a badge, believing it meant she was doing good. But the psyche is not fooled. It will send signals, dreams of drowning, visions of endless staircases, the feeling of disappearing while others grow stronger in your presence. These are not just metaphors, they are warnings. The unconscious will not tolerate prolonged imbalance. It will show you where your empathy has become an escape. It will show you when your giving is a disguised plea for approval. And when you see it, you will be tempted to flinch, to say, "No, that's not me, I'm just a caring person." But if you are to become whole, you must ask, where in my kindness am I still trying to be irreplaceable? Because even the most beautiful offering, if done from fear, becomes a prison disguised as purpose. There is a difference between presence and possession. To be present with someone's pain is sacred. To try to own their healing, that is not love. That is control. The subtle possession begins when empathy says, "I will carry this for you," but secretly hopes the other will stay broken. So the empath never has to face their own emptiness. This is the great inversion Jung called enantiodromia, when the healer becomes the one in need of healing, when the empath becomes the controller, when light, unexamined, casts the darkest shadow. So what now? Do we abandon empathy? Number, we refine it. We enter the next phase of the journey, the path of discernment. The question is no longer, how do I help? It becomes, am I helping from wholeness or from hunger? And it is there the true transformation begins. There comes a point in the empath's journey when even love becomes too heavy. Not because love itself is a burden, but because it has been twisted, fused, entangled with obligation, with over-identification, with the silent belief that unless you carry others, you are somehow unworthy. This is when the soul begins to whisper, not loudly, not with anger, but with a tired ache that says, "I'm still here, and I'm drowning under everything you've picked up that was never mine." Carl Jung called it individuation, the process by which we separate from what is not us, so we may finally become what is. But for the empath, individuation is not just a spiritual theory, it is survival. Because too long without boundaries, too long soaking in the psychic waters of others, and you forget what your own soul sounds like. You confuse their sadness for yours, their rage for your truth, their longing for your calling. And in that confusion, the self fades. Not abruptly, but gradually, like a candle slowly smothered by the weight of smoke that was never its own. Empaths are gifted, yes, but gifts require guardianship. And the most sacred act of guardianship is the act of discerning where you end and others begin. That is the core of individuation. It is not selfish to step back. It is not cruel to say no. It is not betrayal to choose your own center. Jung warned us, when you live too long inside someone else's pain, you begin to abandon the architecture of your own psyche. You forget the language of your own dreams. You forget the rhythm of your own joy. You become the housekeeper of other people's wounds, but your own house collapses. This is the crisis of the unconscious empath. They confuse empathy with self-erasure. They confuse attunement with absorption, and in the name of love, they abandon themselves. But love, true love, the kind that heals without controlling, cannot come from someone who has not yet claimed their own being. You must individuate. You must return to yourself. That does not mean you stop feeling. It means you stop confusing feeling with fusing. It means you learn to say, I feel your grief, but I am not the grave that must hold it. I see your fear, but I will not let it disfigure my path. I love you, but I will no longer carry your unlived life on my back. This is the sacred separation that Jung spoke of. Not separation from connection, but from enmeshment. Not separation from compassion, but from the belief that compassion requires sacrifice. Because if you do not pull back, if you do not take the time to become yourself, you will live forever as a mirror for others and never once see your own reflection clearly. The path of individuation is not glamorous. It is not Instagram-worthy. It is messy, raw, slow. It is waking up at 3 a.m. and realizing you don't know how to cry without wondering if it's someone else's sadness. It is feeling guilt when you rest because you've built your worth around holding others together. It is confronting the child inside you who learned that love must be earned through pain, patience, and perpetual availability. But in this confrontation, there is liberation. You learn to feel without drowning. You learn to listen without losing your voice. You learn to hold space for others without turning yourself into a psychic landfill for everything they refuse to deal with. And slowly, like the first light returning after a long storm, you begin to remember who you are beneath all that you've carried. That remembering is not soft. It is fierce. It is holy. It is the spine that empathy forgot. And from that place, from that solid, individuated center, you can return to the world, not as a savior, not as a sponge, but as a sovereign soul who knows how to care without collapsing. Let us go deeper still, because individuation is not the end. It is the threshold. There is a moment in the empath's life when the realization hits like thunder in a silent church. I was never meant to be a sacrifice. Yet for so long, you were. Not because you were weak, but because the archetype was strong. The wounded healer, the martyr, the silent savior. These were the masks you wore not to deceive others, but to survive yourself. You inherited them like spiritual heirlooms, passed down through generations of women who were taught that love must be earned through exhaustion, and men who were praised for bleeding quietly. And so, like them, you bled beautifully. You broke gracefully. You absorbed what others rejected and called it compassion. But Jung would warn, any archetype left unconscious will eventually devour the soul that carries it. The martyr is no exception, because what begins as love slowly becomes addiction, to pain, to being needed, to being the only one who understands. This is the shadow of the empath, not feeling too much, but fusing too easily. You become a sponge. You soak in everyone else's sorrow. You hold it in your gut like borrowed ghosts and pretend it's holy. But here is the quiet truth. There is nothing sacred about disappearing for someone else. There is nothing spiritual about making yourself small so others can feel safe in their avoidance. You were not born to carry what was never yours. You were born to reflect it, to witness it without absorption, to honor it without entanglement. This is the shift, from sponge to mirror, from martyr to mystic. And the mirror does not flinch. It does not argue. It does not prove. It does not beg to be seen. It stands still. And in its stillness, it becomes something rare, a space where truth can emerge without distortion. To do this, You must let go of the old compulsion, the one that says you must suffer to matter, bleed to belong, fix to feel whole. That compulsion is not your calling. It is your captivity. You are not here to lose yourself in the ache of others. You are here to remember who you are in the presence of their ache. That is the mark of true psychological maturity. To hold space for someone's darkness without confusing it for your own. To feel someone's pain and say with quiet strength, "I see you, but I do not become you." This is not detachment. This is rootedness. This is not coldness. This is clarity. Because the moment you lose your center in the name of empathy, you are no longer helping. You are disappearing. And the world does not need another lost healer. It needs witnesses. It needs containers. It needs those who can walk beside the burning house without running into the fire just to prove their love. Jung understood this danger. He called it psychic inflation. The soul identifying with an archetype so deeply that it forgets itself entirely. The empath who thinks they must save becomes possessed, not by demons, but by the idea that pain must be shared to be real. But not all pain belongs to you. And not all suffering needs a savior. Some wounds need silence. Some grief needs solitude. Some healing begins only when you step back. The conscious empath knows this. They do not merge, they mirror. And in doing so, they offer the most powerful medicine of all, presence without possession. That kind of presence does not drown, it does not bleed, it does not lose itself to stay connected. It witnesses, it reflects, and in that reflection, the other sees their own soul, perhaps for the very first time. This is your task now, not to carry, but to become, not to absorb, but to illuminate, not to save, but to stand as the sacred mirror you were always meant to be. Let us now begin to ask the most dangerous, most liberating question of all. If I am not what I carry, then who, truly, am I? The moment, quiet and barely visible, when the awakened empath steps out of the storm, not because the winds have ceased, but because they have remembered how to stand. They no longer tremble at the chaos around them. They no longer flinch at another's pain. And most importantly, they no longer abandon themselves in the name of love. This is not the end of their sensitivity. It is the sanctification of it. The empath who has walked through the underworld of projection, shadow, and archetypal entanglement no longer feels compelled to take on what is not theirs. They've stopped mistaking pain for purpose. They've stopped confusing absorption with compassion. They now carry a deeper kind of empathy, one that is rooted in clarity, anchored in discernment, bathed in boundaries. This is the final transformation, the shift from emotional contagion to sacred witnessing, from unconscious fusion to soulful presence. The conscious empath doesn't feel less. They feel truer. They don't numb themselves to stay sane. They've simply learned what belongs in their vessel and what belongs in the world to be transformed on its own. They become what Jung once envisioned. Not a saint, not a savior, but an individuated soul. A being so in touch with their own inner life that they no longer need to merge with another's to feel alive. They no longer seek wounds to mend. They no longer crave brokenness to feel needed. They have stopped searching for purpose in exhaustion. Instead, they embody something more enduring, a kind of luminous sovereignty. They have become the living threshold between shadow and light, between human suffering and divine presence. And in their presence, something strange begins to happen. People begin to soften, not because they are rescued, but because they are seen. People begin to awaken, not because someone healed them, but because they finally felt safe enough to heal themselves. This is the alchemy of the conscious empath. They do not fix the world, they remind it of its forgotten wholeness, remind it of its buried grace, remind it that love is possible without sacrifice. Their boundaries are not walls, they are sacred lines of integrity. Their no is not rejection, it is reverence for their own soul. And their silence, it's not avoidance, it's a mirror, reflecting the wisdom of the unconscious without judgment, without rush. They are not drawn to chaos anymore. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They choose relationships where they are met, not used. They choose solitude when it speaks louder than company. They have learned to sit in the center of their own psyche without being haunted by every voice that passes through. They have stopped being the emotional regulator of the room. They are no longer the unspoken therapist, the unacknowledged savior, the invisible crutch. They are visible now, to themselves, fully, finally. This visibility, this sacred self-seeing, is the ultimate revolution of the empath's path. Because the world does not need more martyrs. It needs mirrors, strong, clear, sacred mirrors. And the empath, when truly awakened, becomes that mirror. They do not just reflect what others are, they reflect what others could be, not from illusion, but from embodiment. They carry not just wounds, but wisdom, not just sensitivity, but structure, not just love, but love with a spine. This is the empath reborn, not in service of suffering, but in service of truth. And when you stand in their presence, you do not feel saved. You feel remembered. You feel the forgotten possibility that you too can carry your pain with grace, that you too can set it down, that you too are more than what you feel. This is the final image the dream gives us. A figure of light and shadow, open but whole, present but rooted, feeling but free. The empath, awakened, walks not as a wounded healer, but as a whole human being. A living vessel of the self. There is a moment on the path when silence begins to feel different. It is no longer the silence of suppression. It becomes the silence of listening. Listening not to others, but to the self, finally, unmistakably, without noise. For the empath who has walked through shadow, martyrdom, and illusion, there arrives a sacred turning point, not marked by drama, but by three subtle, powerful questions. The first, is this emotion mine? It sounds simple. It is not. For the unconscious empath, emotions have always arrived like weather, sudden, unannounced, sweeping. They cry and don't know why. They rage and it feels ancient. They fall in love, but it's entanglement disguised as intimacy. But when you begin to ask, is this mine? You begin to draw a line, not a wall, a membrane, a porous but intelligent boundary. You begin to see that not all grief is yours to hold, not all rage is yours to answer, not all sadness is a call for your service. This question is not dismissal, it is discernment. It is the moment when your psyche says, I will feel, but I will no longer fuse. And then comes the second question, sharper, deeper, and sometimes more uncomfortable. Am I helping, or am I controlling? This one stings, because it asks you to look underneath your care, underneath your nurturing, underneath your desire to be there for others. It invites you to ask, what is fueling this act of service? Is it compassion or fear? Is it love or the need to be irreplaceable? There is a shadow to every light, even the light of empathy. And this shadow often wears the mask of the helper. It whispers, if I stop helping, they'll fall apart. If I stop carrying them, they'll leave. If I stop fixing them, I'll lose my value. And so the empath becomes the quiet manipulator, not out of malice, out of fear. But this fear, if left unnamed, becomes possession. It turns healing into control. It turns love into transaction. When you ask, "Am I helping or controlling?" you break the spell. You take your hand off the puppet strings of another's life. You allow them to suffer. Yes, to suffer. Because sometimes suffering is the medicine, and to interfere is to steal their transformation. And now, the final question, the most haunting, the most liberating. Am I present, or am I performing? This one pulls the curtain back. It asks, when you show up for others, are you there? Or are you playing the part of the understanding one, the selfless one, the ever-available one? Presence is quiet. Performance is rehearsed. Presence feels like breath. Performance feels like pressure. Performance exhausts. Presence expands. This question is where many empaths finally break, because they realize they've been performing worthiness their entire lives, through kindness, through sacrifice, through spiritual overfunctioning. But the soul does not need to perform. It needs to be. And when you dare to stop performing, you find a strange, unfamiliar stillness, a terrifying and holy space. You no longer rush to soothe. You no longer over-explain. You no longer bleed so that others feel whole. You just exist, rooted, open, awake. And from that rootedness, you can finally say, I see you, but I do not merge with you. I feel you, but I do not dissolve into you. I walk beside you, but I will not vanish for you. These questions are not philosophy. They are thresholds. They are mirrors held up to the soul. And the soul, when seen, begins to return. Not as a sponge, not as a savior, but as a sacred presence. And that presence? It heals without trying. It reveals without force. It loves with boundaries and lives without apology. That is the true empath, not lost in everyone else's chaos, but found, finally, in themselves. We don't live in caves. We don't meditate in forest hermitages. We live in cities, among phone rings, unread emails, and relationships tangled in layers of unspoken emotion. And it's right here, in the chaos of the everyday, that the empath's skills must be sharpened the most. You might be a mother who's exhausted from sensing your child's unspoken sorrow. A daughter who can feel her mother about to cry, even behind a smile. An office worker who silently carries the emotional tension of an entire team. Or someone who always knows something's wrong, but doesn't know how to stop absorbing it all. And the first thing you need is not to save the world, but to rescue yourself. Start by slowing down. When you walk into a room, ask, is the energy heavy here? Or am I just mirroring someone else's emotional state? When someone unloads their sorrow onto you, don't automatically receive it as your sacred duty. Ask yourself, am I here from compassion or out of fear that I'll be abandoned if I don't please them? Second, practice the art of doing nothing, a skill deeply underrated but absolutely essential for empaths. When a friend is in pain, you don't always need to offer advice. Sometimes your full and quiet presence, without trying to fix or heal, is the most powerful gift of all. Third, build energetic boundaries not as walls of rejection, but as acts of self-respect. Empaths don't need to shut down emotionally to survive. They need to learn how to filter emotions, the way a gardener knows when to water the soil and when to let it breathe. And most of all, remember, you don't need to save the world to be worthy of love. You don't need to carry everyone's pain to prove you're good. You don't need to be a mirror for someone else's darkness, especially when you're still learning how to hold your own light. Carl Jung once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." So, look within. Clear the space of your soul, not to escape the world, but to meet it with a heart shaped by wisdom, boundaries, and deep self-understanding. When you do this, you are no longer a victim of your sensitivity. You are an awakened empath, not a sponge that absorbs, but a mirror that reflects light. Not a savior, but someone living fully in truth. And from that place, the world around you begins to change.